war, when the Protestants went to war. And we're going to be quoting from the work by the great 19th century historian J.A. Wiley, The History of Protestantism. The History of Protestantism. Now, the version that I have, you can find online, brethren. I've mentioned this before, and I get emails and phone calls from people asking me where to find it. You can find it on Amazon. And the set that I have is a 4-volume set. It's massive, but it's just incredible history. And if you want to read history that really has been lost here in modern times, why? Because of what Dr. Ronald Cook calls the de-Protestantizing of America. The de-Protestantizing of America. That is what we have been subjected to, I would argue, over the last 50 to 100 years. Now, this is really the objective of the Marxists in our system. And Marxism, of course, is driven by Jesuitism. So, destroying the elements of the great Protestant Reformation, which established the free world, established freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to bear arms, etc., all of these things, to overturn them, you really have to get rid of Protestant ideology. And we remind our listeners, those who maybe haven't been listening to our program for very long, that when Samuel Adams signed the Declaration of Independence, he said, "I trust from this day forward the reign of political Protestantism shall commence." That was his view of the Declaration of Independence for the United States. It was all based upon the political ideology of the great Protestant Reformation, because it began with theology. There's no question about that, and defending the gospel of Jesus Christ. But then, as Rome launched the Counter-Reformation and was determined to stamp out Protestantism, which, as Wiley calls it, he calls Protestantism revived Christianity. And so now the Jesuits, through a whole variety of schemes, you read Wiley's work, there are so many massacres, so many murders, so many scandals and things that have happened for hundreds of years. And Protestants, when they took up arms finally and realized that they were going to have to fight, they were fighting, according to Wiley, for the cause of the gospel, so that the free preaching of the gospel would not be put to an end, because that's what you had with the Inquisition. It's why it's so important that we understand the Inquisition, brethren, that we understand that the Inquisition outlawed the Bible and outlawed the free preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's why we find these elements at work with socialism and communism and this militant atheist secular humanism that is afflicting the Western world even today. I think this is very important because of what we're watching happen in our country right now. You know, there has been this tragic shooting now in Santa Fe. The Santa Fe school shooter has been identified, a 17-year-old, who now, even though I haven't seen it yet reported in the mainstream, InfoWars has an article on this, and they reveal that this guy wore a trench coat with Nazi symbols, like the Nazi cross on there, and he had a T-shirt that said, quote, "Born to Kill." And so he was also reportedly into Satanism. He had satanic imagery and this kind of thing on some of his online profiles and whatnot. So Satanism and Nazism, of course, it all goes together. And this is the guy who has been responsible for this terrible tragedy that has happened in Texas. And of course, right on cue, we have all of the left-wing Democrats, the anti-gunners, in hysterics, and Hollywood and the usual suspects on the left, calling for more gun control, repealing the Second Amendment, et cetera, et cetera. And they're using yet another tragedy instigated by somebody who really is driven by leftist ideology. I mean, you look at a lot of these shooters are people who have been fanaticized and radicalized by leftist hatred in one form or another. That's what's driving them quite often. But they're, again, of course, blaming the guns, blaming the firearms. Now, it's very interesting. Just some quick statistics. Alex Jones had Ted Nugent on his program, and they were talking about this. And Jones reports that the number of people killed in these random shootings is 50 to 60 people a year on the average. 50 to 60 people a year. Brethren, go do your homework on this. Just go online, look up the number of people that will die from drownings. I discovered this a little over a year ago. You got about 3,000 to 3,500 people a year will die in lakes and swimming pools from drowning. Just drowning because they're out swimming and something happens and somebody drowns. Nobody has ever called for banning swimming at the lake or closing down swimming pools or making swimming pools in your backyard illegal or anything like that. They haven't even called for more regulation of swimming pools. They haven't done anything like that. And you have many, many, many more people who are dying every year in our country. Remember, we've got a population of over 320 million people. That there's 50 to 60 people out of 320 odd million who are shot and killed by some random shooter. That is an incredibly low number. It's an incredibly low number. Much, much lower than the people dying from car accidents, drug overdose, crimes committed by illegal aliens, and a whole variety of other issues. It's a very, very low number. Now, it's still a tragedy, and we're not trying to suggest anything other than that it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. Nobody argues with that. But saying that this very small number of victims in this particular area, that this should be the number one issue for our political system, and that the Constitution should be turned upside down on behalf of this, while we ignore all of these other issues that are much more lethal to the average citizen, is completely illogical, makes no sense whatsoever. Makes no sense. Why? Because they don't really care. I don't believe they really care about the victims here. They just want to overturn the right to bear arms in our country. That's what they want to do. Here's an article from USA Today. Chicago ends 2017, last year, with 650 murders. 650 murders just in the city of Chicago. Now, 650 divided by 12, that's about 54 murders per month. In other words, within 2 months, in just one city, Chicago, that is driven by the most extreme forms of gun control that we have in the country, probably. Some of the worst gun control laws, most extreme gun control laws, are in the city of Chicago. And they have killed in that city every month about as many people as are killed in these random shooters all over the country every year. One city. One city. We have thousands of cities in the country. Most of the cities in our country are actually very, very safe. Vast majority of them, 90% of them. Very, very safe. You don't have this kind of thing going on. But how often do they talk about gun violence in Chicago in the mainstream media? Typically, they avoid it. They don't want to do a comparison because it proves that gun control, the excessive red tape that they have for firearms, all it does is disarm law-abiding citizens. The criminals don't care about gun laws. They don't care. They're not going to be restrained by them. But how do we protect people everywhere else in our society? How do we protect the politicians? We protect them with armed guards. We have armed police, armed military personnel, armed Secret Service agents surrounding the president, the members of Congress, the government, operates every day with armed security. There. We were in Washington, D.C. last summer, and we were outside the gate looking at the White House. And of course, they were paced about 20 feet apart from each other, armed security guards standing around the White House. Now, of course, the crowds of tourists were there taking pictures and this kind of thing, but they still had armed security there with rifles on their chest, pistols on their hip, making sure that nothing strange happened at the White House. And there's no reason why, brethren, if we want to protect the kids in our schools, there's no reason why we should not have armed security guards at every public school in the country. There's no reason why. That's what we should be using our tax money to fund that, not send billions of dollars to third world countries halfway around the world who hate us and want to kill us. That makes no sense whatsoever. And so the common sense approach, the people like Dianne Feinstein, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, how do they make sure that they're safe? They make sure of their own safety by having armed security guards around them, all of them. Bloomberg, same thing. There's a video out there made a couple of years ago with Bloomberg, and he's surrounded by armed security guards, and an independent journalist confronted him and asked him whether or not his security detail had arms. Are they carrying weapons? And of course they were. And Bloomberg didn't want to talk about it. He just, avoided the conversation. But this is the problem. They know full well what it takes to protect somebody. If you want to protect them from harm, you guard them with armed security. Even in the Old Testament, brethren, if you read in 2 Kings chapter 11, you have when Athaliah, who was that wicked woman she's called, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal. But then they took Joash, who was an heir to the throne, it says, and stole him from among the king's sons which were slain. And they hid him, even him and his nurse, in the bedchamber from Athaliah, so that he was not slain. And he was with her hid in the house of the Lord 6 years. And Athaliah did reign over the land. Now, you skip down, then when he gets older, they decide they're going to restore him as the rightful heir to the throne, and they're going to get rid of Athaliah for her treason. And so they set guards about him. And you read down in verse 8, it says, "And ye shall compass the king round about, every man with his weapons in his hand, and he that cometh within the ranges, let him be slain. And be ye with the king as he goeth out, and as he cometh in." Okay, and this was commanded by Jehoiada the priest. They surround the king, every man with his weapons, and he that cometh within the ranges, let him be slain. In other words, if anybody crosses the boundary that they set to protect the king, if anybody violates that boundary, let him be slain. But how is the king protected, the young king, to make sure he's not slain? He's the heir to the throne. He's protected with armed guards. What I wanted to talk about is from the history of Protestantism, when Protestants decided to take up arms and take to the field to defend their fellow believers in Christ and to defend the free preaching of the gospel. Very, very interesting, fascinating period in history, but this is what ultimately led to the establishment of the free world, brethren. This is what led to things like the Second Amendment, ultimately, was there. I mean, if we understand it at its foundation, and we understand the history, and it's a complex history, there's a lot of historic information. Again, I recommend Wiley's History of Protestantism, but you'll see it all developing. The reason for the right to bear arms is to defend the free preaching of the gospel among God-fearing Christian people. That's the reason for it, so that law and order, God's law, can prevail and the gospel can be freely preached. And of course, Rome and her Jesuits were always trying to stamp out the preaching of the gospel. in favor of popish superstitions. All right, but let me just read a quote here from Wiley when he's talking about the Protestants in France preparing to take to the field and to take up arms because their fellow believers were being slaughtered. He says at one point, here's a quote. He says, quote, "At this supreme hour, and deliberately staking the honor of their houses, the revenues of their estates, the glory of their names, and even life itself. What could have moved them to this but their loyalty to the gospel, their deep, thorough, and most intelligent conviction that the Reformed doctrine was based on Scripture?" They were fighting to defend Reformed Protestantism, which, as Wiley has told us elsewhere, is revived Christianity. Christianity rescued from apostasy. All right, just prior to this, he talks about one of the great Protestant heroes of history and one of the leaders of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, Coligny, Coligny, Admiral Coligny, who was one of the great heroes of that era, who was ultimately murdered, brutally murdered during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. His severed head was reportedly sent to the Pope in Rome. And so all of these things are happening, these frightful things are happening. And Wiley says here, this is in chapter 7 of volume 3 of the History of Protestantism, he says, quote, "While Coligny, shut up in his castle of Châtillon, was revolving the question of civil war, events were solving that question for him. Wherever he looked, he saw cities sacked, castles in flames, and men and women slaughtered in thousands. What was this but civil war? The tidings of today were ever sadder than those of yesterday, and the tidings of tomorrow would, he but too surely guessed, be sadder than those of today. The heart of his wife, the magnanimous Charlotte Laval, was torn with anguish at the thought of the sufferings of her brethren and sisters in the faith were enduring. One night she awoke her husband from sleep by her tears and sobs. 'We lie here softly,' said she, 'while our brethren's bodies, who are flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone, are some of them in dungeons, and others lying in the open fields, food for dogs and ravens. This bed is a tomb for me, seeing they are not buried. Can we sleep in peace without hearing our brethren's last groanings?'" All right, so notice Admiral Coligny's wife has her conscience is troubled at the idea that fellow believers are out being slaughtered, being devastated and demoralized and so on, while they're sitting comfortably in their castle. And here you've got this admiral who was a mighty man of war, and he's a Protestant, and he is reflecting on, when do they take up arms and go out by force and defend their brothers and sisters who are being slaughtered? And his wife now is compelling him to do something. And so he says, quote, "Are you prepared?" asked the admiral in reply, "to hear of my defeat, to see me dragged to a scaffold and put to death by the common hangman? Are you prepared to see our name branded, our estates confiscated, and our children made beggars? I will give you," he continued, 3 weeks to think on these things. And when you have fortified yourself against them, I will go forth to perish with my brethren." "The 3 weeks are gone already," was the prompt and noble reply of Charlotte Laval. "Go in God's name, and he will not suffer you to be defeated." A few mornings only had passed when Admiral Coligny was seen on his way to open the first campaign of the Civil Wars. The Civil Wars begin in 1562, and Coligny would live for another 10 years beyond that. He suffered both successes and defeat during these civil wars. But nevertheless, he's remembered historically as a great Protestant Huguenot, greatly admired by Protestants and some Catholics. Very interesting. King Charles IX, who becomes the king, and he's ultimately the king who was responsible for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Colony became one of his close advisors. Charles IX admired Colony. But his mother, Catherine de' Medici, she was a very rabid Roman Catholic, very extreme, and she is said to have been the chief instigator, along with the Jesuits, for the massacre itself. If you study what was going on was really an attempt at an ecumenical sort of agreement between Protestants and Catholics. He was trying to get the king, Charles IX. He grew rapidly in favor. I'm going to read this. This is, you can find this on Wikipedia. It says, Colony grew rapidly in favor with Charles IX, becoming a close mentor to the weak, easily manipulated king. As a means of emancipating the king from the tutelage of his mother and the faction of the Guises, the admiral proposed to him a descent on Spanish Flanders with an army drawn from both faiths, meaning Catholic and Protestant, commanded by Charles in person. The king's regard for the admiral and the increasingly bold demands of the Huguenots alarmed Catherine de' Medici, the queen mother. So here you had then the wedding of the Protestant king, Henry, King of Navarre, and then the sister of the King of France, Marguerite de Louvois, the king's sister, who was a Catholic. So here you have a Protestant king marrying a Catholic queen. This is why I say there was kind of an ecumenical event that was going on. And it would seem that Admiral Coligny was influencing King Charles in France toward this sort of ecumenical agreement, not necessarily theologically, but politically. And this alarmed Catherine de' Medici. And it is said that it's literally the day after this wedding happens, on August 22nd, 1572, the day after the wedding festivities, then you have Coligny. He's shot in the street by a would-be assassin. He's not killed. And then it is said that the Catholics feared some sort of retaliation from the Huguenot Protestants. And so it was decided, rather than to wait for retaliation, 2 days later, to go ahead and unleash the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. And that was August 24th. So this is, and it appears to have been somewhat of a spur of the moment massacre, but it is one of the most notorious events in the history of Western Europe. Because here you had the king and the queen directly involved with the mass murder of thousands of people who had come there. They had come there for a wedding. They'd come there for wedding festivities to celebrate this idea of this sort of ecumenical union between a Protestant king and a Catholic queen. And it leads to this horrible massacre, horrible, terrible tragedy. But ultimately, they took up arms and they fought. Why? For the cause of the gospel, the cause of the free preaching of the gospel. Discussion on the moral will of God versus the providential will of God. We started to talk about this on the last program and reached a certain point. I want to continue the discussion because the examples that we find, that we're going to get into today, examples that you can find in the Bible, those examples are very powerful. But on the last program, we started to talk about the analysis, the understanding of Romans chapter 13 from the perspective of our Protestant, Reformed, Christian forefathers. And I think this is so important because not a few of them, this was the very heart and backbone of how they saw the Bible and government, and what they believed about the responsibility of Christians where government is concerned. And I think it's where these lessons are lost, where they were lost in the 20th century because they changed the history books, they turned education upside down, and what's happened is Christians who should have and could have known better if they'd have had access to this information and this knowledge and so on, might have in many countries have avoided the calamities of tyranny and oppression and the wickedness of socialism and communism that have ravaged many countries over the last 100 years, historically Christian countries like Russia, like Germany, and so on, and countries that are now in peril of falling into this deadly trap where communism is concerned. And yesterday on the program, I was talking about the situation in South Africa. South Africa is the current casualty of communism, Marxism at work in a historically Christian country, and now has that country right on the brink of ruin, right on the brink of being overthrown fully and completely. It was subverted through Nelson Mandela and the ANC. Now they are on the brink of ruin, total ruin. And there are some of them, I mean, some of the interviews with the white farmers down there, and I can't emphasize enough, these are Christian people, most of them are God-fearing, Bible-believing Christian people. And if you see them in their manner of life, their way of life, and so on, guys, they've got a lot in common with America. They have a lot in common with our country and our people. It's why I think this is worth talking about, because they are, what's happening in their country could be happening in our country over the next generation, if the Marxists are not opposed, if they are not put down in America and resisted. And we have the tools in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration, in the Bible, and the teachings of our forefathers. We've got the tools to put them down and prevent them from wrecking and ruining our country. But the question is, will Christians step up to the plate and prevent it from happening? It's often said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. All right, but let's go back to our discussion here, because what I think throws a lot of Christians into doubt and questioning is Romans chapter 13. But it's important to remember that our forefathers, through the Reformation and through the English Civil War, through the Glorious Revolution and the American Revolution, they all of them talked about Romans 13, sooner or later. But let's read over part of this again. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So over and over again, we see Romans 13 says the government is to operate as the minister of God to thee for good, and that when the government is operating as the minister of God for good, then Christians, and really all people, cannot resist, should not resist that power, because that power has been put in place by God. So this is where the idea, the understanding comes from the moral will of God, or the preceptive will of God versus the providential will. In other words, God has issued certain commandments that are to be obeyed, and yet we find ourselves in circumstances where we have leaders who are not obeying the commandments of God. What do you do when you have leaders who will not obey God's commands? That's the problem they're facing in South Africa right now. They have a government that is promoting both theft and murder, against the Christian population there, and they are scrambling about trying to figure out what to do about it. And in our country, we're facing many of the same elements. It's not as bad here as it is there. But we have those same elements at work. Okay, so again, back to our article from Pastor Greg Price, where he's discussing the Westminster Confession of Faith from 1647, and where he says, quote, "The ordinance of God," Romans 13:2, "is not equivalent to every civil authority that God in his providence places upon a throne." So in other words, the person sitting on the throne is not necessarily equal to what God has commanded. So we read, "That which God directs in history by his providence is not necessarily that which he orders by his moral precepts. Therefore, it must be maintained that the ordinance of God is determined by the moral and revealed will of God," divine revelation, as Blackstone would say it, and our forefathers during the American Revolution, divine revelation. That's really what's contained in the Declaration of Independence, guys, where it says the laws of nature and of nature's God. Go to the website for the Lonang Institute, Lonang. That is what they're talking about there, laws of nature and nature's God. That's what Lonang stands for. And it's a website maintained by Christian lawyers. These are attorneys who argue the principles of American law based, and what does that phrase mean? Well, it's an ancient Christian phrase that has to do with the laws of nature in the creation and the laws of God in the Bible. That's what it means. And this is called divine revelation, or the revealed will of God. So then we read, "For if there is no distinction established between God's moral will and God's providential will in determining who is the ordinance of God, the following errors will certainly result." And this is where we got to in the last show. A, first error: if there's no distinction to be made between the preceptive will of God and the providential will of God, then providence is equally in all respects the rule of duty, as much as is the precept. Then no matter how evil a civil magistrate becomes, he must be acknowledged to be the ordinance of God and the minister of God to thee for good. You see what I'm saying? Now, of course, I'm reading this from the article. But that's a very powerful point, that if you don't make a distinction between God's declared will, his commandments, versus the circumstances that he's provided, if there's no distinction made, then you end up having to receive whoever is in charge in government as the ordinance of God and the minister of God to thee for good, etc., even though they might not be that at all. So that's a challenge. Okay, so that's one. Two, if there's no distinction to be made, then providence must express God's approbation and institution in civil government as much as his preceptive will. One must conclude then that anything God states in his moral law concerning civil government is merely a suggestion rather than a moral commandment from God, which civil magistrates may take or leave at their own discretion. So in other words, if there's no distinction, then God's law is really just suggestions. Rulers, government can say, well, we will or we won't obey. They don't know. They'll just pick and choose whatever they feel like obeying, which of course is kind of where we're at in our country today. Again, number three, if there's no difference between the providential will of God and the moral will of God, then why would only murderers and thieves who ascend to the civil throne be acknowledged as the ministers of God to thee for good, and not the murderer or the thief who usurps the place of a father as head in his family, or who slaughters the elders of a church and claims authority to rule in the church? If one would not recognize the tyrant who usurps the leadership in a family or a church as the ordinance of God,
Why should he recognize the tyrant who usurps the leadership in a nation? Okay, so that's really kind of powerful. And this goes into what the reformers believe. The reformers believe that all government really begins in the home with a family. Right at the beginning in Genesis, when God says to Adam and Eve, he says to Eve, your desire shall be toward your husband, but he shall rule over thee. That, for many, is the beginning of government, the household, the father, the mother, the children. That's where government begins. Parents are, if you will, lesser magistrates in their home. And this, again, you can feed that into castle doctrine. Every home, a man's home is his castle. And you're in charge of the government of your home. So that's where it begins. So it's like saying, okay, if some guy could come into your house, kill the husband and the father, and then kidnap the wife and the kids and take them over, I mean, that's really no different than having somebody come in and usurp the throne of authority through murder and theft and this kind of thing. And then take over a government when they don't really have the authority to do it. And in the Bible, we have the example, for example, in the Old Testament, Athaliah, who was the wicked woman, where she kills all the seed royal except for one of the young men, the boys. She kills all the others, and she takes over as the queen. And she rules for about 7 years. And then when the child is old enough, they kill her, get rid of her, and then they put the rightful heir on the throne because she usurped the throne. So they did not acknowledge her authority. Now, the same could be said for socialism and communism coming into a country, because under God, socialism and communism have no authority whatsoever and should not be regarded by Christian people. All right, let's go to our commercial. Providential will versus God's moral will. God's openly stated commandments, what God has clearly stated, the positive laws of the Scripture, versus God's providential will. In other words, what circumstances has God provided in any given situation, and how should Christians respond in light of what we are commanded in the Word of God? Now, very interesting, before we went to the break, I was talking about socialism. At this point, I think everyone is well aware, especially in the Christian community, that the Democratic Party and many of those on the left are openly promoting socialism in our country. It's not just Bernie Sanders anymore. It is the Democratic Party. Some of the Democrats seem to be resisting, but many others are not. And now that you've got an article out there with Jim Carrey, who appeared on the show with Bill Maher's TV show, in which Jim Carrey is saying that Democrats ought to embrace socialism fully and just stop apologizing for it. And anybody who studied the history of the Democratic Party knows that they've been moving in that direction for decades. For decades, brethren. It's why I say it's so important that we understand this movement, that this is not some sudden, pull in a certain direction. It might seem that way. But the reality is the movement to subvert our political system and our education system and so on, at this point, goes back almost 100 years. I could trace it back almost 100 years. Now, somebody else might be able to trace it back further than that. But I could show you from real history, not conspiracy theory, but real history, that yes, you can trace this movement back to the 1920s easily to the 1920s, with congressional records supporting the fact that yes, communists and socialists have infiltrated our system since the early part of the 20th century. And this is a long war that they are fighting in our country. And they're doing it within our system. And so I honestly believe we as Christians should be aware of this, because they have targeted Christianity as enemy number one. And they are perverting the churches. They're getting into the churches with perverse doctrines and teachings, not the least of which is the advance of homosexuality in the churches, promoting gay marriage. We know that there are many Catholic churches that promote this, but now you've got more and more Protestant evangelical so-called churches that are promoting this as well. And it's a movement that has been at work for decades. And there's no question it's diabolical, it's evil, it's wicked, but we've got to stand up and speak out. And I think the key to stopping this movement, and if it's possible by the will of God and with the help of God to put a stop to it in our country, what I think we should do is go back and look at our forefathers who were successful at overthrowing the Dark Age, overthrowing the Inquisition, putting a stop to the depravity in centuries past. What did they do? What did they believe? How did they understand the Scripture? That seems to be a wise course of action. All right, so that brings us to the analysis of Romans chapter 13 and what it means to resist the ordinance of God. Are you resisting the ordinance of God? For example, was the Christian baker who refused to make a gay wedding cake, was he resisting the ordinance of God? And of course, the answer is no, because homosexuality is contrary to God's preceptive will. God's precepts, God's morality, God's commands are that homosexuality is wrong. So the government has no business promoting it. They have no authority to promote it. All of our forefathers would have, to a man, said the same thing. They have no authority to promote it. In fact, they've abrogated, they forfeit their authority when they begin promoting something that God calls an abomination, and they should be resisted to the uttermost. All right, and of course, resistance happens in different ways in the Bible. Quite often in the New Testament, we find the apostles avoiding, Jesus a number of times. They're getting ready to arrest him, and he simply avoids them and goes the other way. The apostle Paul, when he's in Damascus and the governor tries to apprehend him, he's lowered down in a basket and he escapes the city. We find that repeatedly happening in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there are examples of resistance, like the story of Jehu, where Jehu overthrows Queen Jezebel. There are other examples of resistance where you have, for example, when King Saul wanted his men to kill the priests of the Lord, and because his men feared God, they said no, they refused to do it. On another occasion, King Saul wanted to have his own son Jonathan killed because Jonathan had violated his somewhat hasty command that everybody should fast to the end of the day, even though that's not something God had necessarily told him to do. But Jonathan did not hear the command, and he ended up eating something. And as a result, Saul found out, and he was going to have him put to death. But Jonathan had won a great victory. And so the people said, no, we're not going to let you put Jonathan to death. So they took him and they hid him. They got him out of there. So there are different ways of resisting an unjust ordinance or an unjust commandment. But the point is that the Bible does not tell us at all, Old Testament or New, that we as believers in Christ and those who fear God should go along with corruption in government, or that we have to cooperate with a wicked ruler or governor or judge, whatever the case may be. And the word that they would use again and again is the word lawful. They would make reference to lawful government. You read some of the reformers, they talk about lawful warfare. They would make it a point that war is not wrong of itself, but it must be lawful warfare, warfare that operates according to the commandments of God and the ordinances, the boundaries that God has given for war, which is very, very different from what we have in the anti-war movement On the left, the anti-war movement tends to condemn all war, even a just war against wicked powers. They say, oh, war is wrong, all war is wrong, this kind of thing. But of course, they're engaging in propaganda and psychological warfare because their arguments are illogical. All right, I wanted to read this. This is from the Confession of Saxony, 1551, that repeatedly draws reference to the idea of lawful government. Lawful government. Okay, Confession of Saxony, 1551, says, quote, "We teach, therefore, that in the whole doctrine of God delivered by the apostles and prophets, the order and degrees of the civil state are avouched, and that magistrates, laws, judgments, and the lawful society of mankind are not by chance sprung up among men, and that although there be many horrible confusions which grow from the devil and the madness of men, yet that the lawful government and society of men is ordained of God." The lawful government and society. This heavenly doctrine we propound unto the churches, which establisheth lawful authority and the whole civil state. His wisdom is declared by order, which consists in the discerning of virtues and vices, and in the associating of mankind under lawful governments. So over and over again, the confession draws attention to lawful society, lawful government, lawful authority, and lawful governments in the plural. And as we study the Bible, we realize that there is really no government. If you read Psalm chapter 2 carefully, all governments are ultimately held accountable to the moral law of God. All right, brethren, psychological warfare. If you study psychological warfare, in the history of the modern world especially, even though I'm sure you could trace this back to the ancient world as well. But if you study the history of psychological warfare, as I've observed it in all the different things that I've looked into for our films and for this radio program, it appears, I've come to believe, that psychological warfare is probably the most lethal weapon that is at work in the world today. It's the most lethal weapon. It's worse than an atomic bomb, in my opinion, because it can cripple an entire country and keep them from doing what they need to do to defend themselves. This is by and large what is affecting Western civilization. Psychological warfare and brainwashing. The suicide mentality, as it's sometimes been called, has been entered in systematically into the schools and colleges and universities throughout the United Kingdom, throughout Western Europe. Even now here in the United States, a very similar process has been ongoing for decades. An anti-American network of lies and misinformation, things quoted out of context, etc., to demoralize the American people and to convince them that the country's not really worth preserving, so that they'll just give up and hand the country over to communists and socialists. In fact, the Webster's Dictionary definition of psychological warfare is, quote, "things that are done to make someone, such as an enemy or opponent, become less confident or to feel hopeless, afraid, etc." Then they use it in a sentence, quote, "the Army used radio broadcasts into enemy territory as a form of psychological warfare." And this was done throughout World War II. It was done in Vietnam. In fact, very interesting, there is, if you go and you study the Vietnam War, there's a number of articles on this, but the Soviet Union was really backing communism in Vietnam. And they spent more money. They spent like $1 billion on propaganda, on anti-war propaganda here in the United States and elsewhere, to turn the hearts of the American people against the war, to believe that the war was wrong, it was immoral, America shouldn't be there, and on all the stuff with Jane Fonda and the leftist news media that tried to make American soldiers look like murderers and thugs and all this other kind of stuff, while justifying the communists, etc. It just absolutely dreadful. In fact, there's an article online called "How the Soviet Union Helped Shape the Modern Peace Movement." Of course, what they mean by that is not really modern peace, but rather modern anti-war. And at one point, the article says, quote, "One of the biggest untold PSY operations in history was one of the Soviet Union's against the USA during the Cold War era. In one of the most devious war tactics ever conceived, Russia created, founded, and funded various peace and anti-war movements on American and foreign soil throughout the 50s, especially the 60s and 70s, and well into the 80s. America's war efforts having stopped Nazi as well as communist world expansion, they needed to come up with something new to beat their enemy. Outside of the works of scholars and historians, you will not hear much about this in mainstream media because the idea of covert mass manipulation on such a grand scale is not taken well among the general public, especially when it addresses something as idealistic and nice-looking as the peace movement." Okay, and then it goes on to say the Soviet Union wisely spent more money on funding of U.S. anti-war movements during the Vietnam War than on funding and arming the Viet Cong forces. And that's a quote from Stanislav Lunev, highest-ranking GRU officer to defect from the USSR. And then the article goes on to talk about the KGB influence of the so-called peace movement, where, you know, it's very, very interesting. I've studied this on and off for years. I've come to believe that, I mean, and you realize, brethren, this is the reason why we lost the war in Vietnam. This is the reason why. I saw a documentary some time ago, and it had to do with the war in Vietnam. And they were talking about how, we were there for more than a decade. And when the war finally came to an end and we were ready to withdraw, basically to admit defeat, pack up and go home, the American leaders went in, they sat down with a communist commander, and they said to him, reportedly, they said, you know, you never beat us on the battlefield. We won every battle. And he said, I know. And he said, I also know it doesn't matter. And what a powerful lesson. You can win every battle and still lose the war. I mean, it's almost unheard of in the pages of history, but it shows the power of psychological warfare, because that is what defeated America in Vietnam. What defeated the United States was not guns, it was not bombs, it was not soldiers, it was psychological brainwashing. It was a systematic demoralization of America, America's interests there within the homeland, having Americans who should have been loyal to the country instead running around and declaring that the country was evil, what we were doing was wrong, we were an immoral country, the soldiers should be ashamed, America should be ashamed, and on and on and on. And basically, the will to fight and win was taken away, was destroyed, trampled on. Now, should we have won the Vietnam War? Should we have defeated communism there and made sure that a democratic system of freedom was established? Well, if we had done that, then Vietnam might have ended up like Germany after Nazism, or like Japan after imperialism, or like South Korea when we drove the communists out of South Korea. South Korea went on, even though it's not as much talked about as Germany and Japan, but South Korea went on to become a very successful country and still is today. Very successful. They've got the key elements, I mean, just in terms of economy, education, law and order, things like that, that countries want so that they can thrive and prosper. But North Korea was a different situation. In North Korea, we had control of North Korea, but then China came in with its soldiers and pushed our guys back. And then the manipulative politics of America would not allow General MacArthur to go back and reclaim that territory. And that's when MacArthur, said famously, "This isn't war, it's half war." And he recognized there were enemies working within our country that were preventing him from doing what you would do to win a war. And again, all of that plays into psychological warfare. But back during the golden age of Hollywood, the film was made, The Manchurian Candidate, the original Manchurian Candidate, which in my opinion is much better than the one Hollywood made later on. The original is much more startling if you watch it, with Frank Sinatra. It's an older black and white movie, which I highly recommend. If you've never seen it, you really should watch that film, because there's a scene that I think is very telling, where you have these American soldiers, and they are sitting in a room, and they're surrounded by all of these communist leaders. There's like a whole audience of communist leaders that are sitting around them. And they're talking to these American soldiers, and the American soldiers look like they're off in La La Land somewhere. And they keep going back and forth, and they're showing you what reality looks like to these soldiers versus what's really going on around them. And the soldiers think they're at some kind of garden party with these older ladies, in their dresses with their purses and their hats and flowers and this kind of thing. And they're all sitting there talking about, the kind of thing that some ladies gathering would talk about. But the reality is they're not sitting at a girly little ladies gathering. What they're doing, they're being surrounded by all these communists. So they have a completely false understanding of reality through systematic brainwashing. Their understanding of reality is completely false. And when you see it and you watch what's going on in this film, it is a picture of what is happening in our country and the Western world today. We're surrounded by enemies, and we're told that somehow or other these enemies are harmless, they're our friends, it's only bigotry and xenophobia and all this other kind of stuff that compels anybody to be concerned about our country being invaded by illegals and by people who hate us and want to kill us, etc. Psychological warfare. You've got right now with the education system. There is a great website called stopk12indoctrination.org, and they've got a series of articles for those who are concerned about what's going on in the education system. Of course, we've talked about this with the Reese Committee going back to the 1950s, and the fact that back then they discovered, this is Congress now, U.S. Congress discovered through the Reese Committee that these tax-exempt foundations, the Rockefeller, Ford, Guggenheim, and Carnegie, that they all developed programs back in the 1920s to subvert our education system and rewrite the history books to get us away from our Judeo-Christian foundation and lead the national worldview into more of a socialist and communist way of thinking. This was deliberately done. And it was discovered, and it was documented, and it's been reported for years. But for whatever reason, nobody has acted upon this information. A lot of people know about it, but nobody's acted upon it and said, hey, we need to get these communists and these socialists out of our classroom. And now, of course, what they're doing is they're bringing in the Muslims. They're bringing in Islam. And that's one of the things that is talked about on this website, stopk12indoctrination.org. Their top story, CARE, Council for American Islamic Relations, CARE infiltrates public schools. And then it shows a whole committee on CARE. One of them is Linda Sarsour, who openly advocates for Sharia law in the United States. There are people who believe that where Sharia law is concerned in America, there are people who believe, brethren, that it's simply a matter of time before that agenda advances in our country. We need to pray that God will give us the wisdom and grace to prevent that from happening. All right, let's go to our commercial break. You can't help but think about the psychology of creating hysteria like what we're watching right now with the Kavanaugh, the Judge Kavanaugh ordeal, this ongoing drama that's unfolding now, where you've got some woman who, after more than 30 years, is making these claims about Judge Kavanaugh, Dr. Christine Ford. Dr. Christine Blasey Ford has made claims that Kavanaugh, back when he was 17 years old, had apparently done something, did not actually rape her, but supposedly assaulted her in an attempted rape episode. That's the claim. Now, the remarkable thing is, throughout his adult life, Brett Kavanaugh hasn't done anything like this. I mean, there's no other reports of any kind of behavior like this from him throughout his adult life, throughout his career, anything like that. He doesn't have a pattern of behavior with this, which you usually find. Like when all the stuff came out on Harvey Weinstein, you just had all of these women that came out, and they had similar testimonies. You don't have anything like that with Judge Kavanaugh. That's why this whole thing is very, very strange. It's been more than 30 years, and she's never said a word. She's never had to come out and make a statement. It is reported that she is rabidly anti-Trump, against President Trump, and of course, like a lot of your feminist women, just fanatical over things like Roe v. Wade. That is almost certain. And that's the big concern, that on the left, they're concerned that if Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed on the Supreme Court, that Roe v. Wade will be overturned. And so there's all of this hysteria going on. But I watched the interview with Judge Kavanaugh. He's being interviewed on Fox with Martha McCallum. And you could see he was visibly disturbed by what's going on, all of these accusations against him. He really does appear to be a man, because he revealed in the interview that at the time that that he knew this woman, he was a virgin, and that he continued to be a virgin for many years after he got out of college and so on. So he, the idea that he was running around assaulting women, it just seems even that much more unlikely. And of course, I was thinking earlier today about this, and I thought, we certainly believe that if women suffer something like this, they ought to be able to speak out about it. But at the same time, the argument from the left that you should always believe the accuser, that you should always believe them, no matter what. Of course, they don't practice that at all, because if they did, then they would believe the accusations against Bill Clinton that have been made by a number of women, but they didn't believe those. We also have in the Bible the story of Joseph, and Joseph being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife of attempted rape, which he was not guilty of. He ends up being thrown in prison as a result. Joseph does. So we know from the scripture that it's entirely possible that a woman can make a false accusation. That's entirely possible. But this whole situation, there's all of this hysteria, and you're watching the people on the news get on the news, and the politicians and the journalists, and they're all saying, we have no doubt that Dr. Christine Ford's testimony is true. She's a credible witness. What she's saying is true, and on and on and on. And of course, most of these people don't know her. They can't possibly know whether or not this is true. It's not really a logical assertion that she's making. And now President Trump has allowed them to delay the vote on Kavanaugh for another week, so that the FBI can investigate. So apparently the FBI is conducting an investigation, although everybody keeps saying, well, what are they going to investigate? And now you have reports of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. Here's one from Natural News, also documented by InfoWars. And it says Kavanaugh accuser Christine Blasey Ford ran mass hypnotic inductions of psychiatric subjects as part of mind control research funded by foundation linked to computational psychosomatics neurohijacking. I mean, that's kind of a complicated headline, there's no doubt. But now apparently it is being reported that she was involved in some kind of mind control programs and has connections with the CIA. And you can find that, again, on Natural News. You can find it on InfoWars. InfoWars is reporting that Christine Blasey Ford has connections to CIA deep state. Here's another headline. Christine Blasey Ford ran literal CIA mind control program at Stanford. Now, again, these are headlines that are coming out. The CIA and mind control. While you have conspiracy theories, brethren, this is simply a fact of history. MK Ultra and exploring methods of psychological warfare. That's really what mind control is. It's psychological warfare. And there's no question that the CIA has been involved in this for decades. It's what I think the film The Manchurian Candidate is really getting at. I mean, it's exposing it from the Soviet communist perspective, but we had communists at work in America. Not only that, but our military and intelligence community, knowing that you have this form of warfare out there, they would not ignore it. They would at least explore it, document it, figure out how it works, and how it might be a benefit to the United States. And of course, this is part of the reason why so many people think that the deep state is working against Donald Trump as president. And I think it has not a little bit to do. I mean, there's his policies against globalism. That's one thing. But the fact that Trump, during his campaign, really smashed political correctness. Political correctness is mind control. That's what it is. It's psychological warfare. And while he was running for president, Donald Trump was able to smash and just trample on so many of these different ideas that are consistently thrown at the American people, all the brainwashing and the intimidation and this kind of thing. Political correctness is psychological warfare. It's important that we recognize that. I've said on this show before that all of these accusations of racism and bigotry all the time, that trying to turn everything into racism, this is psychological warfare, especially once you realize that the whole concept of racism does not exist anywhere in history prior to 1901. Nobody anywhere went around talking about so-called racism. It didn't exist. But in the 20th century, it is said to have been developed by communists. I've heard that repeatedly, but you can see it. The only reason anybody believes all this stuff about racism and bigotry and so on is because they put it into the schools. They got into the education system and started brainwashing our young people while very young. When we're watching 19 and 20-year-olds out there shouting and screaming, and they're yelling things like trans lives matter. I mean, just think about the phrase and everything that goes with it. It's completely psychotic. Trans lives matter. And that means you've got to go out there and defend some guy's right to put on a dress and lipstick and go into the girl's bathroom. It's utterly, completely insane. But it's the result of people being brainwashed in our schools to get them to think this way. It's like the deep state has been working, and the Marxists have been working to turn our youth into a whole generation of Manchurian candidates, people who are just brainwashed with a false understanding of reality. So they'll go out there and yell and scream and ultimately cooperate with the enemies of our nation in overthrowing what began as a Christian society. You know, I think about Paul the Apostle when he wrote to the Galatians, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 1, he said, O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you, that ye should not obey the truth? Who hath bewitched you? Psychological warfare bewitches a population. That's what I think. All right, brethren, we are out of chapter 13 and the death of England. We might even call this the death of Europe. This could be called the death of the West in some ways, although I still think that there is the possibility that here in America, in the United States, that things can be turned around. I do believe much of the Christian world, as I've said many times, is under attack. And there are a number of scriptures that I want to go over today in light of events that are happening. I mean, you go to some of the stories that are out there. One that caught my eye here in England, in London. Now, we've talked before about the knife attacks in London and the fact that the murder rate in London under their first Muslim mayor of London, the murder rate in London now, because of knife attacks primarily. This is the new phenomena there in London. These gang members and these migrants, these Muslims, often now, because guns are outlawed, they've been banned, they often use knives to attack and kill people. So the murder rate in London now exceeds New York City for the first time in about 200 years, it is reported. First time in about 200 years, London, the city where the police, the London Bobbies, were known for not carrying a gun. They simply had a police baton and a pair of handcuffs, typically. In fact, today, many of your police officers in the UK still do not carry firearms, but more and more of them are carrying firearms because of the increase of crime that's going on in that country overall. And there's no question that the dramatic rise of crime and trouble is twofold. One, because they are allowing all of these Muslim migrants who are not compatible with Western civilization, they are allowing them into these countries in Western Europe. That's one. And two, where England is concerned, because they disarmed the people in 1997. Now, a story just appeared on Breitbart that says specifically, this is the irony of it. Firearm discharged up to every 6 hours in gun-free London. Firearm discharged up to every 6 hours. So about 4 times a day in the city of London, not just England now, but in the city of London, 4 times a day. And it says, quote, a think tank has called for an increase in police stop and search in London to tackle the crime epidemic after it revealed that a gun is shot in the capital up to every 6 hours, despite the UK having some of the strictest personal firearms ownership laws in the world. The report, It Can Be Stopped, published by the Center for Social Justice, on Monday examined the average number of days between a gun being fired across London and found that the, quote, figures equate to a reported gun discharge almost every day, every 27 hours. Okay, all right, so. However, it goes on, we have heard evidence as part of our work to suggest that a significant volume of gun discharges and gun crimes go unreported. Considering underreporting, the think tank estimated that, in fact, London's gun crime figures would mean a gun discharge in London every 6 to 9 hours. Okay? And then goes on to talk about how London's police launched their 100th homicide investigation of 2018, with a capital on course to break its 2017 murder total of 116. So they've seen, since they've had the London mayor, Sadiq Khan, the Muslim, the capital has seen a 16.3% rise in gun crime. and more than 31% rise in knife crime. So another report says that half of all robberies take place in London. The city of London, it's unfortunate. Now, the thing to keep in mind, you go back to the days of Nicholas Nickleby and Oliver Twist and that kind of thing. London had big problems, even worse problems than this. So while this situation is bad, there's no question it's bad and it's getting worse. London used to be a beautiful city, a peaceful city, and it still is, I'm sure, in many ways a beautiful city. But it is now being riddled with crime because of this migration disaster that's going on. But things can be turned around, brethren. Things can be turned around. I don't want to give the impression that that's not possible, but they've got to get somebody there who's willing to turn it around. Then you have another article on Front Page Mag that says, quote, a diversity of acid attacks, witchcraft abuse, genital mutilation, and terror. Immigrant groups mutilate, abuse, and kill their own children. That's part of the article. And then it goes on to say 2017 was a banner year for acid attacks in Britain. 465 of them occurred in London. 465. Remember, that's more than one a day. More than one acid attack. London is called, if you go look this up, London is called the acid capital of the world. That's according to The Sun over in the UK, the publication, thesun.co.uk. That was back in December 2017, they said that. London is the acid capital of the world. Other websites say UK has one of the highest rates of acid attacks in the world. Okay? And this is on the rise. Where, I mean, and the acid attacks, that in particular, is just so horrific. You look at what happens to women in these Muslim countries who have been horribly disfigured by acid attacks and this kind of thing. It's just, it's horrifying to think that this would be normalized in any Christian country anywhere. And the people of England should rise up and demand that something be done. Demand that these people be deported out of their country, get them out of there, don't allow them to come there and be citizens. They are simply not compatible with Christian civilization. Now, I wanted to talk about Romans chapter 13, because what this is, brethren, you've got the acid attacks, you've got the knife attacks, and who's firing the guns? Every 6 hours, 6 to 9 hours, whatever the number really is. Who's firing these guns? It's not the law-abiding citizens, probably. It's going to be the criminals. The law-abiding citizens have been disarmed. So it's the criminals with the guns and the knives. They're the ones out committing the crimes. They're the ones causing the mayhem, and the common people don't have the ability to defend themselves. This is why our forefathers put the Second Amendment in place. It's why we have, thank the Lord, groups like the NRA fighting to maintain the Second Amendment in our country. And I believe that we as Christian people should support the Second Amendment, definitely. And remember that it was our Christian forefathers who put this in place, even before the American Revolution. Remember, it was required among the Puritans. It was your duty to be armed. When you went to church on Sunday in Puritan America, you had to pay a fine if you didn't have your rifle with you, your gun, whatever it was. Now, I wanted to talk about Romans 13, because Romans 13, this is really the chapter. Some of your tyrants have used this abusively, because it says, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. So those first two verses are typically used by those who want to impose tyranny and claim that everyone must simply submit to the powers of government no matter what. But during the American Revolution, and even before, the ministers who examined these verses went on to read the rest of it, and actually they turned the tables on tyranny in government. Why? Because verse 3 says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil." Now, the point that our forefathers made, which is, of course, a very important point, that rulers or the government is not supposed to be a terror to good works. I mean, this would have put an end to the Inquisition. If somebody's sitting there reading the Bible, you don't go terrorize that person and threaten to burn them at the stake and this kind of thing like the Inquisition did. You can't do that. Those who are doing that which is good should be rewarded and commended and supported for it. It's those who are doing evil that should be apprehended and punished by the government as the minister of God. As the minister of God. And the government is supposed to be the minister of God to thee for good. And who determines what is good and what is evil? Well, Jesus said there is none good except one, that is God. God alone is good. Looking at this in light of what's happening in the Western world, the governments of the West are completely failing in their responsibility. They're failing in their responsibility to protect the common people. They're failing in their responsibility to punish that which is evil and to support that which is good. Because they're punishing Christians for what they believe. They're punishing Christians for speaking out against homosexuality, against transgenderism, against the idolatries and the wickedness and just pure evil of Islam, which is what has brought in all of these knife attacks and acid attacks and this kind of thing. And then, of course, with that, the systematic rape of reportedly more than 1 million young girls across the UK. More than 1 million. I mean, that's just a staggering statistic, but that's what's reported, and it's reported by official sources. There's the book we talked about before called Easy Meat. That's the title of the book. It's actually based on a comment from one of the political leaders there in the UK. So, and it's citing official sources talking about this. There's a story you can watch and listen to on CBN. They did a story on this, and it's very, very troubling. But it's happening because of the failure of government to operate as the minister of God. All right, verse 13, and the death of England. We might call it the peril of England. England, and hopefully we certainly hope England is not going to die as a country. We hope that there will be a revival, a reformation, a reform that will come about from all of this distress, that somehow, some way, a new Puritan movement will rise up and take action there. I certainly hope so. I hope that for the UK. I hope that for South Africa. There is, the situation in South Africa, just very quickly, has been escalating toward the point where they've been threatening to confiscate white-owned land. The government, the ANC, the African National Congress, which is a communist party there in South Africa, They've been threatening for years to just go confiscate the land from these white farmers who have been on that land for centuries and just go take it by force without any financial compensation. Other techniques that they've employed, from what I've read, have been to go in and offer the farmers substantially less money than what their property is actually worth. And that's another way that, and then to sort of manipulate and intimidate them into agreeing to it. And of course, we've talked about the farm murders and the thousands of people who have been just tortured and beaten and killed in South Africa. I hope they have a Puritan reform of some kind there. There is a book I'm reading now. I'm reviewing it for this film that we're working on the true Christian history of America. It's called The Tyrannicide Brief, the story of the man who sent Charles I to the scaffold, by Jeffrey Robertson. The Tyrannicide Brief, which I recommend if you want to learn more about the English Civil War and then the trial, the famous trial of King Charles I, who was condemned by Oliver Cromwell's Puritan parliamentary government. And they condemned Charles, and he had his head cut off as a result. That was really the beginning of the end of the divine right of kings. And it was the Puritans who effected this whole thing. But anyway, the book deals with the subject matter surrounding these events. The Tyrannicide Brief, Jeffrey Robertson. He's a barrister over in Australia. He holds dual citizenship in Australia and the United Kingdom. And he is, you can go online, you can go to his website, you can find videos of him discussing. There's a great conversation with him talking about the Armenian genocide, and very, very eloquent, very, very both legal and academic arguments against the Armenian genocide and the refusal by the Turkish government to acknowledge that this was not only, because what they do is they try to argue that it was a tragedy. They'll say it was a tragedy. And Robertson's response to that is, well, it's more than a tragedy. It was a crime, and that they don't wish to acknowledge that it was a crime. The Turks have always argued that, well, it was just war. That's their argument. I personally believe the reason they make that argument is because the people they were killing were the Armenian Christians, and under the laws of Sharia and Muhammad, etc., it is not murder to kill an infidel. That's not murder, the non-Muslim. So that is why I think they resist giving into the opposition. Great Britain, the United States, the other nations of the earth that look upon that as criminal behavior. They don't see it that way. That's the whole problem with Islam in the Western world. It's why so many of us say that Islam itself is simply not compatible with Western civilization, because they have a completely different system of right and wrong, once you understand it. Let's talk about two of the Psalms that pertain to government. See, that's the whole issue here with Islam. The governments of the West are failing in their responsibility to uphold justice in the land and to punish evildoers and to acknowledge evil for what it is. Look up Psalm chapter 101. Psalm chapter 101. In fact, I was reading this last night in my Geneva Bible. For those of you who have the 1599 Geneva Bible, which is a great Bible, that's the Bible of the Reformation, the Geneva. Well, in Psalm 101, in the note here over Psalm 101, it says, David describeth what government he will observe in his house and kingdom. He will punish and correct by rooting forth the wicked and cherishing the godly persons. As verse 1 says, I will sing mercy and judgment unto thee, O Lord, will I sing. I will do wisely in the perfect way till thou comest to me. I will walk in the uprightness of mine heart in the midst of my house. So he's talking about, apparently, according to the footnotes here, says, though as yet thou deferrest to place me in the kingly dignity, yet I will give myself to wisdom. In other words, David is foretelling what sort of king he's going to be once he is in charge of the nation of Israel. He's not yet there, apparently, according to this. And I'd never noticed this before. I thought it was really interesting. But so he says, I will behave myself wisely in verse 2, verse 3. I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. I hate the work of them that turn aside. It shall not cleave to me. A froward heart shall depart from me. I will not know a wicked person. Who privily slandereth his neighbor, him will I cut off. Him that hath a high look and a proud heart will I not suffer. Mine eyes shall be upon the faithful of the land, that they may dwell with me. He that walketh in a perfect way, he shall serve me. David imagining, what's he going to do? His eyes are going to be upon the faithful of the land. He's going to favor them. Those who walk in a perfect way, those who are mature in the sight of God, he shall serve me, David says. Verse 7, he that worketh deceit shall not dwell within my house. He that telleth lies shall not tarry in my sight. Think about that in terms of the doctrines of Islam. And with Islam, we'd have to include the methods of the radical left, the socialists and the communists, who routinely use deception. This is why I think they get along. They routinely use deceptive methods to advance their aims. They use deception to advance their wicked agenda. If you go to Psalm chapter 82, it says in verse 2, how long will ye judge unjustly and accept the persons of the wicked? Verse 3, defend the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy, deliver the poor and needy, rid them out of the hand of the wicked. Rid them out of the hand of the wicked. It's a responsibility to deliver those who are suffering, the innocents who are suffering, to deliver them out of the hand of the wicked. And that, I believe, is I believe it's our responsibility as believers in Christ, whenever possible, to be able to fulfill these things, but especially for those who have the power of government. It's their responsibility. And look at what's happening in the Western world. So many people being afflicted by evil and wicked men who are being allowed to come in and to victimize the Western world. So we certainly hope and we pray that in time God will turn these things about. We know that he will eventually. Eventually, Christ prevails in the end. In Christ is the victory. All right, brethren, that is going to do it for us today. We are out of time. We'll stop it there. Which is getting worse and worse. Now a news story about President Obama. In fact, I was just on Worldview Weekend with Brannon over at Worldview Weekend Radio, and we did a show talking about Obama giving a speech in South Africa in which he glorified Nelson Mandela. Mandela, who had been on the United States, his organization had been on the U.S. terror watch list from the time of Ronald Reagan through the Bush era. In fact, you had, here it is. This is from an article on thenewamerican.com. It says, in response to the wave of brutal terror against civilians of all races, President Ronald Reagan's administration put Mandela and his Soviet-controlled ANC, that's the African National Congress, on the official U.S. government terror list. President George H.W. Bush and President Bill Clinton allowed them to remain there quite appropriately. By contrast, Obama glorified Mandela with borderline blasphemous rhetoric acting as if the former terror leader were some sort of messiah whose every teaching must be studied by humanity and implemented worldwide to achieve justice and equality. So this is the difference between Obama, of course, and other leaders who have come before, although we know that really the groundwork for Obamaism or the Obama era socialism that is now really taken a giant leap forward since the 8 years of the Obama presidency. Then with Bernie Sanders running for president, I feel like Bernie Sanders really ignited a wave of radical socialists and leftists to just come out of the woodwork, and whatever they were saying before about not fully admitting that they were socialists, now they have been emboldened to come out and just openly proclaim socialism. And of course, it's interesting, but the communists and the socialists, they've had to be very, very careful. Mandela, when he became president of South Africa back in 1994, and through his entire time in power, he denied that he was a member of the Communist Party. And that later turned out to be untrue, that he was in fact a member of the Communist Party, but he kept it a secret. He didn't want to come right out and tell the world that he was a communist. They didn't want to come right out and admit that this was really the communist takeover of South Africa. They didn't want to admit to that, but that's exactly what happened. That is exactly what happened. And as Brannon pointed out on his program, when he and I were talking about this, he's talking about the groundwork for this being laid in America, because what's happened in South Africa and what is currently happening in its own way is also happening in America. We're not as far down the line as they are. We're not as far along, but they're probably 20 or 30 years ahead of us. That would be my estimate. It's hard to say exactly, but that would be my estimate. They're farther along, but they're trying to do the same thing here. You study what happened in Rhodesia. We've talked about it before. That was a Western European country, or a country built by Western European white people who were generally a Christian people. And they built a very successful country called Rhodesia. Today, it was taken over by communists with Robert Mugabe and became Zimbabwe. And its economy and everything just completely destroyed by Mugabe's communist leadership. And people have been subjected to all sorts of brutality, murder, torture, all kinds of atrocities that simply never happened during the time that the country was Rhodesia, when it was in the hands of Western European whites who were generally Christian. Same thing is true in South Africa. The situation in South Africa now is said to be far worse than it ever was under the apartheid. The apartheid was actually a much more reasonable system that worked better for everyone, because it took into account the differences among the different people. You have a Christian population over here, and then you have the blacks, many of whom were pagans. They were cannibals. These are people with witch doctors and so on. Obviously, their culture was very, very different. And so it was necessary to protect everyone involved to maintain an element of separation there. But the communists were not really interested in any sort of racial equality, even though that's what they were arguing. What they wanted was to take over the country. So what they did is they flooded the country, which is a very, very successful country, South Africa, flooded the country with a lot of foreign blacks from other parts of Africa, and then demanded that they be given equal citizenship and an equal vote. They did the same thing in Rhodesia, which becomes Zimbabwe. This is what they're doing here in America, folks, by flooding our country with illegals and then demanding amnesty. You see, they're building up this massive illegal population here of people who want redistribution of wealth to them. They're bringing them in from the Islamic world, bringing them in from North Africa, bringing them in from Somalia, bringing them in from Mexico. All of these foreigners, they're bringing them in, and they're predicting that by the year 2030 or 2040, whenever it is, that finally they say whites will become a minority in their own country. And they're engineering this. They're looking forward to it. That's what they're planning. And then what they'll do, if they can get away with this, is have the non-white majority vote in such a way to basically turn the country into a communist or a socialist country, because then they'll have the majority. And that's effectively what's happened in South Africa. It's what happened in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And then they just systematically destroy the country from there. So this is why these events are very important. It's very important that Obama, who I'd always seen as kind of an American version of Mandela, although not quite as bad, honestly. Mandela was a terrorist and he was a thug. And he was responsible for killing a lot of innocent people, both black and white. And he pled guilty to more than 150 counts of public violence and effectively terrorism. And it was said that if he had done in America what he did in South Africa, the American people would have demanded that he be put to death. They would have demanded it. But for whatever reason, the South African government chose to be lenient toward him and gave him a minimal sentence and allowed him to go free eventually, and then he becomes president of the country. But anyway, I wanted to play a clip here because there's a number of things going on in South Africa. You had Obama down there giving a speech, a very deceptive speech. I mean, if you go through his whole speech, he's down there talking about how politicians outright lie and things like that. The things that Obama's, I just couldn't believe it listening to it. I listened to it about a week and a half ago and could not believe the things he was saying, where he's talking about how Obama, or that politicians, he said, politicians just make things up, he said. They just lie about things. You can't even get them to tell the truth anymore. And of course, if you're an American, you're sitting here remembering Obama with, if you like your doctor, you'll keep your doctor. He's going to reduce your health care costs by $2,500 a year. He's going to cut the national debt in half. He ran for office saying he believed in traditional marriage, not gay marriage, etc. One thing after another after another. Obama told one lie after another after another. And then he has the audacity to get up and talk about how politicians, those other politicians, are so dishonest. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Unbelievable. But I think it's why Christians and patriots need to be tough. We need to be discerning. We need to recognize what's going on, and we need to take a stand for the truth and oppose this system of lies that is being fomented in our country and in other parts of the world. And where South Africa is concerned, we have to recognize, brethren, we should be praying for the brothers and sisters in South Africa. When we hear about them as the whites. If you study them, you will learn these are generally Christian people. These are Protestant Reformed Christians, most of them. And they have a very similar value system to our own. But now I want to show you what they are dealing with politically. All right, now this is a video clip from some of the really excellent work that has been done by Lauren Southern. Lauren Southern, who's an independent journalist, and she's been over there to South Africa, and she spent some time, and she interviews a woman, a black woman who is with a group called Black First, Land First. But I'm going to let her introduce this, and then you hear from the representative of Black First, Land First. Listen.
But it seems their politics have strayed further from the Rainbow Nation mantra over the years, as their rhetoric more closely mirrors extremist groups like Black First, Land First, who proudly tout the line, land or death, by which they're referring to the death of white farmers.
Black people have been patient enough. We are of the view that we have to fight in order to attain freedom as the black majority in this country. And the fight has to be located in taking back the land and expropriating it back into the people, in seizing the means of production and expropriating everything, or rather redistributing everything equally. And a society that would embody a value system that puts black people first will have to be attained through confrontation, unfortunately, because our people have waited for so long, right? We've waited for so long, and nothing is happening in terms of changing our lived experience. So it's very important to have a movement such as BLF who's going to say, we don't want your handovers. We don't want you to feel pity for us. We are coming for you, and we are going to get everything that you own. It's ours.
All right, so you heard what she said there. This is from a radical political group called Black First, Land First, and they literally, I mean, when Lauren Southern is describing this woman and their motto, which is land or death, they literally, the woman is wearing a T-shirt that says land or death on the back of it. And you heard what Lauren Southern said, that by this they mean land or the death of these white farmers. And then you heard what she said, what this radical black political activist said, we are coming for you and we're going to get everything that you own. It's ours, she says. And of course, this has to do with the Marxist propaganda, the communist brainwashing that's gone on down there, where they have convinced many of the blacks that this land was stolen from them by the whites. Of course, they say, well, they stole it supposedly 400 odd years ago. And now this is the excuse, of course, for going in and trying to take it back. Now, we're going to go to our commercial break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how this really parallels. This is the favorite argument of the communists and the socialists around the world. You stole the land. Because that argument is happening right here in the United States. And we'll talk more about that, about the situation in South Africa and how this parallels events happening here in the United States. President Obama went to South Africa here a short time ago and exalted Nelson Mandela as some great heroic figure. Of course, if you study Mandela, I mean, that's generally the view. We've got people in churches, we've got people across America who think Mandela was some kind of heroic figure. And it's simply because they don't know the real Nelson Mandela. They know the propagandized version of Mandela that was engineered back in the 1980s and 90s. But that was before the internet, before independent media. And so the impression that many people have is still based upon that propaganda. And that's really what it is. It's propaganda. All right, now before we went to the break, I said when we came back, we're going to talk about parallel situations happening here in the United States. This whole idea of you stole the land. Now, when most people think of that, they think about the American Indians. They think, okay, America stole the land from the Indians, or the white English colonists supposedly stole the land from the Indians. Now, I've talked about this before. I've given presentations on it. It is provable that that's simply not what happened. Many of the early colonists sat down with the Indian chiefs, made deals with them, and purchased land according to whatever price the Indians wanted. That's how the early colonies began and were built up, etc. That is typically covered up or not discussed when people talk about this whole issue with the Indians. But the thing is, there's really not enough American Indians to use them as a significant adjutant. However, you have a second group. You have Mexico. And this is where you have a massive population south of the border. And these are the people that are coming in here by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions, ultimately. And the Mexican people are being agitated against America, and they're being told, America stole your land, and you have a right to get it back. If you go online and type this in, type in land stolen from Mexico by U.S., there's a number of articles. Here's one, quote, this is 2017, just last year. Mexico could demand its stolen land back from the U.S. New York Times, 2017, just last year. opinion. Will Mexico get half of its territory back? Question mark. OC Weekly. Did the U.S. really steal California from Mexico? Did the U.S. really steal Texas and other Mexican territories? Okay, so then you've got another one. Senator says Mexico must reclaim land stolen by U.S. These are articles that have been published in the last year, just in the last year and a half. There is a movement among, this is why many of the Mexicans, if you go online and you see these illegals, they are quite often very arrogant, very proud, and they're very presumptuous. And the reason why they have this attitude, this, hey, we'll come into your country if we want to, whether you like it or not. The reason they have that attitude is because they are being told, they're being indoctrinated, that America stole this land from them and set up this border that's not really a border, or it shouldn't be a border. And now they have a right to come here because all they're doing is reclaiming the land. It's why they have that saying where they say, well, we didn't cross the border crossed us. Okay, that's where that comes from. But this is what the Democrats, the leftists, the communists, the socialists in our country, they are fomenting this argument. And they're using this to promote the open borders philosophy and the idea that nobody's illegal and all of the Mexican illegals should be given amnesty, because what they want to do is they want to do in America eventually what they did in Rhodesia and what they've done in South Africa. And that is build up a population of foreigners in our country that will outnumber the general population of the core population of Americans who actually believe in our Constitution, our system, and freedom, etc., that will outnumber them, outnumber us, and then give them full citizenship and the right to vote so that they can basically vote the patriots of our country out of power. Because that's what they did to South Africa, that's what they've done to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, etc. It's the same process. And of course, they use the same argument. You stole the land, which you could go into any country, anywhere, and you could come up with an argument that the people who live there somehow or other took the land from somebody else. There's really no people anywhere. I mean, especially when you're talking about Mexico, where did the Mexicans get their land from? Why are they speaking Spanish down there? Because their Spanish ancestors hundreds of years ago invaded that territory and stole it from the Aztec kingdom. That's why. That's not originally their land. That's land that they invaded and that they conquered. So why should they especially have a right to it? If you gain a land by conquest, you have to be willing to lose it by conquest. So what they're trying to do is very similar to the Palestinians dealing with Israel. They're trying to cry no fair. Well, the only claim that the Muslims have to the land of Israel is that they conquered it at some point in history. Of course, we believe the Bible. We believe that land belongs to the children of Israel in perpetuity. But nevertheless, they make this argument about how, well, it's not fair. They stole the land. They use the same argument over and over and over again. The argument they used in Rhodesia, South Africa, they use in Israel, they're using here in the United States. You stole the land. You don't have a right to this land, and so therefore we have a right to come in here and steal it, take it by force, use political manipulation, all this other kind of stuff. There's a lot of psychological warfare going on and a lot of deception. And taking it back to South Africa now, in South Africa, if you go online, there's a number of articles. I'm still trying to get to the bottom of it and figure it out. But there is a number of articles out there that tell us that they are now calling that the government in South Africa, the communist government in South Africa, is now calling not just for land confiscation, that they're going to confiscate the land from all the white farmers, but calling for gun confiscation. The confiscation of arms from the common people. And of course, that we all know, why do they confiscate arms from the common people? They confiscate arms usually right before a genocide or a Holocaust or a mass murder. And they've had people, you've got groups like the EFF with Julius Malema. You study Malema and his commentary. He's come right to the line, without quite crossing it yet, of calling for the outright slaughter of the whites in South Africa. Listen, here's a clip.
I don't know what's going to happen in the future. I'm saying to you, we have not called for the killing of white people, at least for now. I can't guarantee the future.
Yeah, but I mean, you'd understand somebody watching that, especially as it gets shared on Twitter, they freak out. It sounds like a genocidal call.
Cry babies.
All right, so you heard Malema. He says he's not calling for the outright killing of whites, at least not yet, he says. And then when the interviewer says, well, people are going to say this sounds like genocide, he just says, crybabies. The people who are complaining are just crybabies. This is what the Christians in South Africa are up against. And the situation is getting worse and worse with each passing day, every month. They seem to get closer to a full-blown civil war. All right, brethren.
I need thee every hour, most gracious Lord. No tender voice like thine can peace afford. I need thee, oh, I need thee, every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior, I come to thee. I need thee every hour, stay thou nearby. Temptations lose their power when thou art nigh. I need thee, oh, I need thee, every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior, I come to thee. I need thee every hour, in joy or pain. Come quickly and abide, or life is vain. I need thee, oh, I need thee, every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior, I come to thee. I need thee every hour, teach me thy will, and thy rich promises in me fulfill. I need thee, oh, I need thee, every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior. Oh, bless me now, my Savior.